Connected Farmer, today we are going to speak to Steve Cachia. He is a consultant for farms in Brazil and he's based in Malta in Europe. He's going to speak with us about the availability of corn in the international markets and the Brazilian exports of corn. He's very familiar with this issue. Steve, how are you today?
Fine, thanks. Hello, everyone.
So, Steve, I've been reading that the Brazilian corn crop will be big, perhaps not as big as previously thought, but the availability of corn in the second half of the year seems not to be so big for the export market. What are your numbers?
Well, I believe that although we had some losses in the second crop, which is Brazil's main crop, I believe it's going to be a big crop. Obviously, a bit smaller than last year's record, but we're talking about a couple of million tons, which actually will not make such a big difference when we see the whole picture of Brazilian production, which today is around 100 million tons. So we have about 75 or something less of the second crop and about 25 million tons of the first crop. We had some drought issues in the south. One of the main producing regions, Paraná State, had losses of something around 2 million tons or a bit more. But as we said, part of it was compensated by good yield rates in Mato Grosso, which is the main producing state in Brazil, in the Midwest of Brazil. So all in all, we should have ample supply. And the supply-demand situation in Brazil for the second half of the year will depend wholly on the ability to export in large volumes. We know that the domestic market is strong and should get a bit, even a bit stronger during the second part of the year. But the Brazilian market is wholly dependent, especially in the second part of the year, is wholly dependent on exports.
What do you expect from the demand side from China?
Well, actually, I believe after the phase one deal between China and the US, I think if anything, the Chinese will focus on importing corn from Brazil, and their focus on the first half of the year was soybeans from Brazil, but probably in the second half of the year it will be corn, and obviously the supply demand situation in the USA means that the USA needs to export quite high volumes. In the case of Brazil, our expectations are, since we didn't export practically anything during the period January-June, Brazil only exported about 3 million tons of corn, when last year we had already exported about 10 million tons of corn. The issue was that in the first half of the year, Brazil needed to focus on soybean exports. Actually, Brazil exported during the January-May period, Brazil exported 50 million tons of soybeans against something around 36 million tons last year. And although Brazil has more ports, more infrastructure, but they still don't have the capacity to export in huge volumes corn and soybeans simultaneously. So in the first 6 months of the year, the focus was on soybean exports, and the second half of the year, the focus will be on corn exports. Even because there's hardly any soybeans left in Brazil to export, about over 90% of the soybean crop has already been traded. So the second year will be open up for Brazilian exports, and the estimates are that Brazil should export something around 35 million tons. Considering that last year Brazil exported a record of 40 something million tons, that means that for the next 6 months, Brazil needs to export an average of around 5 million tons per month.
And give us a little bit of perspective. You've been in Europe for a long time. So how does that COVID-19 has affected farms there and the agricultural markets in Europe?
Well, here in Europe, obviously, it was quite a big issue. You all know, after China, first it was in Italy, then France, the UK. And basically, here the farms are smaller here in Europe. With the closing down of borders, there were a lot of basically the main problem wasn't logistics. Trade was being done. The main problem was laborers, people to work on the farms. We saw that although the hotels and restaurants closed down because of quarantine and lockdown issues, but consumption was still strong, because people obviously ended up spending 24 hours per day at home, and everyone was eating much more at home. So on a generally speaking, the agricultural sector suffered, but not that much. It was mostly the fruit and veg, but the grain sector didn't suffer that much. I think the same thing happened in Brazil, at least for the Brazilian farmers. 2021 is one of the best years ever. We saw soybean prices reaching record levels, corn prices reaching record levels during the first 6 months of the year, completely differently to what was happening on the international market and at the CBOT, CME. This was in Brazil. Obviously, this was basically due to the spike in to the valuation of the Brazilian currency, the real, which was about 3.8 to the dollar 1 year ago and about 5.4 at the moment. So you can imagine the huge difference in the rate of exchange, which gave the Brazilian farmer in reals in their currency a different situation to the American farmer, to the Paraguayan farmer, or to other farmers that trade their product in dollar. The Brazilian farmer actually received record prices for this year's crop.
And from your previously privileged point of view, how do you assess the wheat market? Because wheat has surprised the market over this year with some rallies. Do you think that is going to last?
Well, to be honest, we're expecting even perhaps better prices as regards the wheat market, because what we noticed, especially in this region here in Europe, in Southern Europe, in the Mediterranean region, the Mediterranean area, North Africa, people were scared that there could be some wheat shortages. Countries like Russia and Ukraine perhaps limiting their exports. So there was a rush to some sort of stock formation strategy, which could have pushed wheat prices a bit higher. The thing is that obviously most producing countries found out that production was better than expected, so the market ended up being calmer than was expected. Mostly countries in North Africa, you all remember Arab Spring 2008, when wheat prices practically doubled in a couple of months, created some huge political tension, political problems. So some countries tried to stock wheat and flour in order not to have repeat the same problems of 2008. But as I said before, the supply situation seems quite comfortable. And another important thing is that were some issues, people scared that logistics wouldn't work with lockdowns and quarantine situations. But fortunately for many, the logistic part of the supply chain functioned quite efficiently in many regions around the world. So that made it easy to obviously import or export grains around the world.
Steve, is there something else would you like to add?
Well, my personal opinion, obviously, first of all, regarding Brazil, South America, the focus as regards COVID-19 is over Brazil at the moment. This week we had another news making the headlines, which was the swarms of locusts in Argentina, probably going into southern Brazil. But at least the initial estimates are that they are a pest, they are a problem, yes, but it shouldn't affect the grain production. Losses will be limited. So that situation, plus the economic recession all over the world, is worrying people quite a lot. But the idea is that we should be having a recovery, and this should help probably grain prices all over the world to start reacting, because there's a lot of pessimism around, and not only wheat, but also soybeans. I feel that perhaps soybeans could be starting some moves towards the upside, especially since next week we'll be having the USDA quarterly report, quarterly stock report. Next week it will also be a holiday on Friday, Independence Day in the USA, so we'll be having a shorter week. But all in all, the market seems to be trying to move a bit higher. We are in the full weather market season in the USA. Obviously, up till now, the weather has been favorable, and generally speaking, but obviously there's still time for some kind of scare which could help prices have that bullish tendency, at least for the short run. So generally speaking, we have a situation, at least in the world, where supply is ample. We have some problems and uncertainties as regards demand. We also what happened with the ethanol prices in the USA. But all in all, I believe that, at least from an international point of view, we could see better prices in the second semester and the second part of the year than we saw in the first part of the year. We'll be having, obviously, later on during the year, a harvest in the USA, probably a big harvest for corn and soybeans, weather permitting, obviously, and also here in Europe, the Black Sea region, Russia and Ukraine, although they had some initial scares, weather scares, but it also seems that the weather is helping them to have also a bumper crop this year. Basically, that's our view of the markets at the moment. I think we need some more optimism from outside factors not necessarily directed to supply demand, but psychological factors like related to COVID-19 and the global recession. With some help from that side, you could see prices move a bit higher.
Steve, thank you for your very bright analysis.
Thank you very much.